Welcome to Fostering Voices, episode 113, season 7. This is Chris.
And Hey.
And we are here with a very special guest today. We have Jason Johnson with us. He is, we'll give him a round of applause. He holds many titles. Pastor, you are the director of the National Foster Care Initiative, and that's through that is it Christian Alliance for Orphans, right?
That's another Jason.
Oh,
yeah.
That is really funny.
Yeah, so maybe you meant to have the other Jason.
No, we definitely didn't.
No, I'm my official title is Director of Church Ministry Initiatives.
Oh my gosh, that's.
Are you serious?
Director of Church. Are there two Jason Johnsons on that?
No, the other guy is Jason Weber.
Oh,
We're often. Yeah.
Okay, no, we want Jason Johnson. This is who we want.
This guy.
Yeah.
Well,
the title is used sometimes. No problem.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, we'll edit that part out.
Yeah. Well, that was on the interwebs, so
it was. It was Jason Johnson, right?
Yeah. Huh, that's.
Yeah. Send me where you found that so we can make sure that it's correct.
Yeah, you got it. Because here's the thing, Jason. The interwebs don't lie. So
if there's anything learned in the last year, everything's true online.
So true.
Exactly.
It's accurate.
Exactly. All right. So our special guest is Jason Johnson. He is a pastor, author of multiple books, right?
3.
Yes.
3 is our count.
Yeah.
Are you writing something new right now?
Always working on something.
Always working on something. You are dad. Your husband, dad. You have been a foster dad. You've been an adoptive dad. And,
correct.
All 3 of your books are focused on foster care, adoption, helping orphans.
Correct. Yes.
Awesome.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and how you guys even came to be on this foster care journey.
Yeah, I guess I'll start there. So my wife and I, in 2011, began our licensing process. And the backstory there was we were like a lot of couples who got married. And maybe even before we got married, we had the conversation about, I want to adopt one day. Oh, I would love to do that as well. And just kind of, hey, that would be a neat thing for us to do one day. And so that was already a part of our marriage and our conversation with no expectation on how or when or what or any of that. So we started having kiddos, and around the time that our 3rd little girl was born, we had planted a church, and so we're just very busy, and the church is growing, and actually a lot of people in our church start to have this adoption conversation. And we ended up hiring, one of our very first hires was a children's director, and she grew up in a home that had fostered. And I'll never forget the first time her and her husband became foster parents, and the first time that they walked into church one Sunday with a new placement. And it's as if the Red Sea split and time slowed down, and everyone just kind of, stopped and stared because it was so close. Like, here, it isn't just an idea. It's not just something out there. This is real life. And a lot of conversation in our church had been happening around adoption, foster care. We took a bunch of people to a conference not far from where our church was that was an adoption-oriented conference, and came back from that. And a lot of people actually from that adoption conference came home talking about foster care. My wife and I sat through a breakout session on foster care and realized if what this guy is saying is true about what's going on in our city, that changes everything about our family, about our church, everything. And so we started our licensing process. Our daughters were around 2, 4, and 6 at the time. And then our first placement came in April of 2012. And she actually never ended up leaving. And so she's still with us. We had others come and go. And then about 4 years ago, we started through a long series of events. We opened our home to a young mom with newborn babies. And then that kind of opened us up to a world of young moms with newborn babies. And so our journey the last few years has been on that path, and are deeply involved with the story of one particular mom. And she now has 3 kiddos, and they're a part of our family, and we're a part of hers, and we're kind of grafted together forever now. And so that's a little bit of our journey. It was always a part of our conversation. We show up at this breakout session on foster care, not really knowing what to expect, and walk out, and everything changed after that point. Yeah. At the time, I was pastoring our church, and I began to just write a lot about it and speak a lot about it, and realize this is an issue for all of our churches in our city. And in a city like Houston, I mean, that's enormous, and the need is overwhelming. But just realizing there's a place for helping other churches to think through this, on how they're going to engage, and how they're going to support their families, and how they're going to preach the gospel through this, and to really developed a passion for working with other churches. And our church grew to the point where I was able to actually step out from the lead pastor role and begin working with churches to really engage in this space. And so that's what I've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And how would you say you guys, as the lead pastors, fostering, like, how did that impact your church? Do you feel like foster care became even more prevalent, something that more congregants kind of got involved in because you guys were doing that?
I don't doubt that that's definitely partly the case. I'll never forget, we actually got to a point where around our leadership table, we actually had to have a conversation about making sure that anyone in our church that wasn't involved in foster care, not just opening their homes to kids, but even just wrapping around and supporting, we had to make sure that anybody that wasn't involved in foster care still felt like welcome and comfortable in our church. Like, that's how the tide had shifted. So certainly, I think having someone that's on stage most of the time preaching and communicating while going through really the early stages of the process has an effect on the culture of the church, for sure. As a matter of fact, I think, on several occasions, I said, I think through this foster care journey, you guys are going to get a new pastor as a result of this, not knowing that that literally meant I was going to be gone.
Right.
What I was just, you can't read scripture, you can't preach through the Bible verse by verse like we did without coming across references to God as Father, or God moving towards hard places, or caring for the vulnerable, without kind of using this as an illustration and an application for that. So yeah, I think it had profound impact. If there's any pastors or church leaders listening and feeling like, I guess we should do it to set a good example for our church, that's not do it. I'll never forget, we actually had the wife of one of our staff members who didn't really quite understand at first. She actually questioned us a little bit. I just don't, it was almost a questioning, like, hey, I feel like you're doing it just to kind of set an example for the church. And we had to quickly say, no, that would be the absolute wrong reason to do that, to do it. That's not it at all. And so there's definitely a little bit of that. And, there's some unique challenges that come with being the primary communicator about this, and also being involved in it. Like, you don't want to stand on stage and say, we want to support families who are engaged in foster care. Now, who's going to bring us meals, this week? So there's definitely very fine lines, but it does not hurt to have the primary communicators at a church doing it and living. And the way that I talk with church leaders often about it is, there's kind of the conceptual idea, like, that this is a good thing, that people should do. There's obviously the theological idea, but then there's the experiential piece. And a lot of church leaders conceptually kind of know it's a good thing, theologically kind of know it's a good thing. The experiential thing is where they really struggle. They can't do it or about it from personal experience. And so anytime we come across a church leader that's able to, we definitely see a difference in the culture of the church because of that.
No, I think you know, what you're saying, like when you guys saw this woman walk through your church with a foster baby and the Red Sea parted, you know, something that people often say to us is that, like, we put flesh on foster care, you know, and I, like you guys talked about pre-marriage, like, oh, that would be something we could do. And that was something that we had also discussed, like, oh, sure, maybe one day we might adopt or do something crazy, but who knows, like, what that even looks like. We didn't know anyone who was doing any of those things at the time. And so for our journey of walking through foster care, it was like, oh man, we're taking in these babies. And I just remember for my mom, she didn't understand us fostering this toddler. And I mean, she lives in Canada, but she's also Korean, and our language barrier is kind of rough as it is. But she's like, why do you have this toddler at your house still? I'm like, I'm fostering her. But then, man, when she met our 3-month-old baby after that placement, and she's like, where is this child's parents, you know? And for her, that was the catalyst of like, man, you're doing something huge. Like, why, who would walk away from a baby, you know? And we're like, you know, there are parents out there who need help and who need people to foster their children. And so I think that's just such a big deal to like have an example at church, whether it is a lead pastor or anyone in leadership, to say, man, we know that there's this thing called foster care and that it's a plague in our city. I mean, in Arizona, when we started like 6 years ago, there was an epidemic of like 30,000 kids in foster care in just our state, you know? And it was one of those things where people are like, where are these kids, you know? And then we're like, we have one in our home. And they're like, oh my gosh, like the shells fall off your eyes.
Goes into the whole, you know, power of proximity, where you have that, you know, your congregation where it's when people see that, and our small group has kind of become that too from our church, where, you know, now pretty much every couple in our small group has either adopted through foster care or is fostering right now. So, and
it's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. There's something to be said for bringing it close to people, and the closer that it's brought to people, the less they can pretend like it doesn't exist in some. But also some of the questions that they thought they had immediately go away, or some of the concerns. The closer it gets, the better, the easier it is to see it, and then the more you realize, oh, it's not really what I thought it was. So there's definitely, you know, so we work with church leaders a lot on just how to tell good stories, how to bring things a little bit closer to people, to help, you know, the goal of a story, and even the examples we've shared, when people see families that have placements in their home, stories allow people to see themselves in that position. You know, for example, I live in a big college town. We have 70, 80,000 college students here in a town of maybe 200,000. So the power of story is such that you have to communicate to different audiences. You know, half of our church, there's 3,000 college kids in our church. So we have to be very careful about ensuring that stories connect with different demographics in our church, and a huge one is college students. So if we share stories about college students, the goal is we want college students to be able to see themselves in that story. So if they hear a story about a college student that's maybe babysitting for a foster family, the power in that is we're now giving them giving other students the ability, I can see myself in that story. I can see myself doing that. And you know, these stories of when our children's director and her husband walk in for that first time, and it's the power of proximity, and people begin to see, oh, it's not just a concept, it's not just a good theological idea, it's real human life, and maybe I can see myself in that story. And that really became a tipping point and a catalyst for us in pretty significant ways. And we learned we have to keep this close to people. Otherwise, the natural tendency is to push it far away. It's somebody else's problem. It's an overwhelming problem that I don't understand. I don't even know how I can make a difference. And so we're constantly battling to keep it close in front of people so they can see themselves in it.
No, absolutely. I recognize now, so we are on Zoom, we're on video right now, and we showed the books when we were like, which Jason Johnson are we talking about? but this is actually a podcast, so a lot of people didn't see the books that we held up. So Jason, you wrote Everyone Can Do Something, which is a field guide for strategically rallying your church around the orphaned and vulnerable.
I think the title actually on the cover of that book. Is that right? What does it say down there?
National Director of Church.
There we go.
Yes, there you go.
Not sure what we said last
Yeah.
time that was wrong. But you
So
are
that's
Christian Alliance
Yep.
for Orphans.
Yep.
Okay. And then this is the like your bread and butter, I'm assuming, reframing foster care. This thing is like insane how like powerful it is, and just your passion for obviously for foster care and adoption, but for God's word. I mean, the number of notes I took of like verse after verse after verse that you quoted and that you just like expounded on, I was like, oh my God. Yeah, so it was insane. And we did see that you had during the pandemic last year, during Foster Care Awareness Month, you did a fun little book club. And we watched some of those and they were just so powerful. Like I got so much out of just listening to you talk about your book, but talking about foster care. And then, if you don't read books, then you can watch those. And you said they were on YouTube as well, right?
Yeah, we've put them up on YouTube, and we're thinking about putting together another series of videos that go along with reframing foster care. Yeah, so those two, one is for church leadership, organizational leadership, and then obviously reframing foster care is for the foster parents in the trenches. But I get a lot of messages from people who say, hey, we're considering foster care and we've been reading reframing and it's helped us kind of put together some thoughts and ideas that maybe we wouldn't. So I'd say it's for those that are in the trenches, but also even for those that are considering getting involved. And I think, and part of the goal is even with both of those books, that if you were to pull foster care and adoption out, all foster care and adoption, the goal is that they still stand on their own, right? So everyone, something is just about kind of leadership and strategic planning, and it just so happens to be focused on the scope of foster care ministry. But and then reframing, like you said, is really, kind of the little secret behind the whole thing is it's really about kind of gospel discipleship in the way that and allowing the gospel to transform the way that we think. It just so happens to be, the application of that is in our journey on foster care. But I would hope that as people read that, they see applications even way beyond foster care specifically. Yeah,
absolutely. I think something that stood out to me that you talked about was like we have a discipleship issue in our churches or in our society, and and a lot of people think that, oh, we need to recruit more foster parents, but that's not really the issue. And again, what you're saying, like that underlying goal that you have is for people to recognize there is a gospel and God is calling us to more than living in our safe houses with our safe families and doing soccer on Saturdays. Not that doing soccer on Saturdays is bad, but like just having more than just those things. And so that discipleship issue, for me, I have a heart for young people and I volunteer with junior hires and stuff. And something that like boggles my mind is like young teens having, premarital sex and things like that. And like, we're not doing a good job of selling purity to kids and to teenagers and to, young people who aren't married. But more than selling purity, it's selling discipleship. It's following God and like trusting that he has this plan and he has a good will for you. But so often we're just like, nah, that's too hard. No, that's not, I don't think he's calling me to that. He's calling you to that. But no, God is asking us to all be disciples, not just fans of Jesus and fans of, oh man, that's a nice uplifting piece of scripture. Like, no, these are words that should like propel us to do something different. And as you often say, it's to serve others, to give first and foremost.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really the heart behind the everyone can do something message is we all celebrate the same gospel, but we all demonstrate that in the same way. And so the applications of that are endless and full of creativity, and specifically in the foster care space. Uh, I think that we're more and more becoming very familiar with the idea that it's not just about bringing kids into your home, although that's desperately needed. There's also a million other ways that people can wrap around involved. And so, yeah, the goal is let's press the gospel deeply into people. And then let's give them unique and creative ways through which they can demonstrate that according to their gifts or passions or resources or even past experiences. I find past experiences, good or bad, is some of the best qualifying material for people to serve. I think even scripture suggests that, you'll be comforted so that you can comfort others, meaning there may be some past hurts or past experiences that God has brought you through in part so that you can help other people go through that. And so our goal is just to, and I know it can sound trite at times, and I spend a lot of time in rooms with DHS workers and people who are in charge of recruiting, and we need more families, and for me to stand in front of them and say, the goal is not recruit more families faster.
Right.
I usually get kind of this gasp, like, oh yes it is, but then when we start talking about it's not more families faster, it's the right families longer, then begin to settle in them, because they recognize, you're right, like more families faster right now is producing about a 12-month turnover rate. About the average lifespan of a foster family is 12 months. And it's just a horrible, if we were a business, we'd be out of business. It's a horrible, you're having to rehire and retrain all of your people every 12 to 18 months. You can't sustain. And caseworkers know that. People involved in child welfare know the current recruitment mechanism that we have is not sustainable. And so I think it's on us in the church to kind of go back upstream and say, if the results that we're producing right now are 12 to 18 month lifespan for a foster family, and pretty narrow parameters on the kinds of kids or the ages of kids that Christian families want to take, maybe the problem isn't so much that we're not able to retain people or get them to foster teens or whatever. Maybe the problem is we need to go upstream and figure out what systems do we have in place that have produced that kind of outcome.
Absolutely.
And so I go way back upstream and say, maybe there's a discipleship issue happening up here or not happening up here. That's, you read any business book and they're going to tell you that your system is perfectly organized to get the results you're currently getting. Like,
For sure.
and often look at, how come we don't have enough families? How come families aren't sticking longer? How come we're getting these results? And we blame it on the results. We don't blame it on the system that we've put in place to produce the results. And so for me, in the church world, I believe at the very beginning of that system is discipleship, pressing people deeply into the gospel, and then walking with them along a journey where they begin to discover what's my something to really live that gospel out in the most pure way that I can.
Yeah, I love that. And, in one of your chapters also you talked about, and you just were mentioning it too, like the upstream problems. And when you talked about it, you were saying, there are so many roles that people play. There are the people who are dragging the kids out of the water. We talked about this in a previous podcast because we did read a book called Upstream by Dan Heath. I don't know if you've read it before. It's fantastic. And he used that.
Right here, right in front of me.
I love it. But, you talked about it more in the context of like, man, there are different players playing different roles in saving the children, in like even caring for the people who are taking the children out. And I was even thinking like, man, and then you have the people on the shore who are making sure that the kids are okay and counseling them. But definitely, I think in the foster care world, and when we were in the thick of it, we were pulling the kids out foster. But now that we're able to take a step back, it's like, how are we supposed to support the people who are technically throwing their kids into the water or, losing their children to the system? And how can we better support bio families so that they aren't losing their children to the system? And I just think like, you having a heart for teenage moms and making sure they don't fall into that same cycle that they were in of having been
Right.
in foster care previously.
Yeah, no doubt. It's the river is not linear, it's circular. It repeats itself
But
Mhm.
absolutely.
over again. And we find that in some cases kids are getting thrown in, but in most cases kids are born into it, meaning it's not that um, it's not that some parents are maliciously throwing their kids in the water. It's that those parents are in the water themselves, and that's all that they've ever.
Yeah.
And it's this generational cycle repeating itself, and we begin to look upstream, and we see things like systemic poverty and lack of education and lack of support, and we find this is a perfect recipe upstream to produce the results that we're getting downstream.
Mhm.
And so while it's right and necessary that we engage in foster care and we provide homes for kids, and it's right and necessary that we go downstream and work with aging out youth and issues like homelessness and education and things like that, it's also right and necessary that we look upstream and we say what's producing these downstream outcomes and what can we do about it. And that's you've referenced upstream with Chip and Dan Heath, so huge fans of all their books.
Yeah.
I should get a commission for all the times I sell their books and workshop. I tell every
Yeah.
church leader and organizational leader I work with, you need to be reading their books, especially upstream. But they make the point in there that upstream work is less glamorous and it's far more difficult and it's far more nuanced and it's not as clean. And so it's not that it's easy to be a foster parent. But it's easier to know how to become one. You go to this class, this class, this class, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. And then you get your step right. Now let's go upstream and work with generational cycles of brokenness and young vulnerable moms and all this. Suddenly it's not so clear, like how there is no step 1, step 2, step 3, and then this will happen, right? And I think that, along with a number of other things, really keeps people from looking that direction. But it's encouraging in the last couple of years and the work that we get to do around the country. That conversation is growing significantly in terms of how the church engages in those spaces. In significant ways. I'll tell a personal story. Our church has 3 campuses, and the pastor of one of our campuses literally today, we knew it was coming and there had been some announcements, but today emailed out an update about his resignation process and how at the end of May he'll be done, and what he's going to do. He has started a nonprofit in our city to really address some of these systemic issues of poverty and homelessness that are creating all kinds of problems. And so, even right here today, I've been reminded of that growing focus on what's happening upstream is intensifying. More and more church leaders, more and more ministries are starting to ask those questions in some pretty significant ways. Yeah.
Yeah. What is the name of his nonprofit?
So it's interesting. He, a few years ago, while still on staff at our church, started a nonprofit called On Ramp. So he's a huge car guy. He loves working on cars. And he very rightly discovered that, sometimes it's not huge, major things that contribute to systemic issues. Sometimes it's simple. And one of those simple things is transportation. And we found that to be true with the young moms we work with. How are they going to get, okay, they might be able to get a job, but how are they going to get there? How are they going to get home? How are they going to get their kids to daycare? How are they going to pick them up? And then they might keep the job for a week, and then transportation becomes so difficult, they quit the job, right? And so he loves cars. He loves working on cars. He started a nonprofit called On Ramp, where people donate cars, they fix them up, they work with local dealerships, get discounts, blah, blah, blah. And then they have a process through which churches or organizations can recommend someone. They go through a vetting process and interview, and then they award recipients, and it's usually single moms
Mhm.
with a free car,
Oh,
and
okay.
it's just blown up.
Yeah,
And
we love that.
it's just a great example of here's a guy who said, what do I love? How can I use what I love, the gifts God's given me? What's my something?
Yeah.
And then what's a simple way that I can what's a simple way that I can bring some solution to a large complex problem?
Absolutely.
And that's the way that we want people to be thinking, not you need to go out and solve the whole problem.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It- um, really big problems are made up really of a bunch of small independent problems that
Absolutely.
cumulatively come together and create a big problem. So can we solve the transportation issue? Can we solve the childcare issue? Can we solve the food issue, right? And then cumulatively over time. So he's got On-Ramp, and now he's just announced he's starting a larger nonprofit that's going to address more systemic things. And On-Ramp will be one of those,
Yeah.
but he's recognized there's 3 or 4 major things in our city that if we can really address them correctly, it'll make significant impact.
That's amazing.
That is
Yeah.
absolutely amazing.
Cool.
I know in your church leaders book, you talked a little bit about, finding like a micro issue and how can we, expound on that. And again, in Upstream, they talked about that. I mean, so many of the wins that Dan Heath talked about were like, they corrected
Yeah.
the issue of like kids dropping out of high school. And they're
Right.
like, all the great teachers were in 12th grade, but all the kids were dropping out in 9th grade. Like
Mhm.
how do we bridge that gap? And they're like, we need way better teachers in 9th grade. And we also need to know the names of the kids who are like not coming to class, who are the ones most at risk of dropping out of school. And I just loved just that he talked about like knowing people by name, like
Mhm.
understanding them. And again, that just kind of puts, flesh back on foster care. When we bring kids into our home that we're like, oh my goodness, this child doesn't have a safe place to be. That's why they're in our home. And for our friends to see, what? Like, that's a good kid. And again,
Mhm.
something that we've talked about
Yeah.
on our podcast so much is that the terrible misconception that people have about foster kids is that they're in foster care because they're bad kids.
Mhm.
It's like,
Right.
no, they're not. They didn't do anything to get here.
Mhm.
They might have, a lot of baggage and a lot of, defense mechanisms that make them look like they're a bad kid, but they 1,000,000% are not an actual bad child, And so just coming back to like, this is a child, this is their name, and here's their story. And also going back to what you're saying about the power of story. Our pastor this week talked about Revelations 12:11, like the power of our testimonies, and just like, I feel like that's why we love having this podcast. We love hearing people's stories. And like your stories have been so powerful in reframing foster care
Mhm.
to encourage foster parents to keep going, to encourage people who maybe hadn't ever thought about it, to say, you know what, I think I can do this crazy thing. I think I can foster. And then now for church leaders to say, man, what are these small wins that we can create for our society, for our congregation, for whatever, to at large, make an impact for Christ.
Yeah, no doubt.
Love it.
So, Jason, a question I had for you, kind of shifting a little bit and going back more into your guys' walk in the really in the weeds of everything over the last 10 years. What have been probably the biggest challenges for you and Emily?
Oh, wow. I guess one point is dealing with ongoing effects of trauma
Mm,
that don't just go away.
yeah. Okay.
So, you know, again, going back to let's prepare people well on the front end in the upstream so that downstream as they begin to encounter things and certain experiences, they're as prepared for that as they can be. And one of them being helping families, and we've learned this through our own experience, that the story doesn't end. If you're fostering and you end up adopting, or even if you just go straight adoption, the story doesn't end there. actually the real story begins there. And it becomes this lifelong healing process from trauma and questions. And so that's definitely a part of our family forever now. Um, struggles with, in particular, working with older teens and recognizing, and now the one that's in our life, we met her when she was 17. She's actually now 21. I've had a couple more kids since then, which doesn't make sense, and has made decisions which don't make sense. And that's the point is, it doesn't make sense to us, to her. But not to us. And so understanding kind of the struggle and the tension between what seems very clear and logical and sensical to us is completely backwards to someone. And so even for us and other families who might be listening or watching, recognizing that any assumptions you have about how people are going to respond to what you're doing for them, throw them out the window. The idea that we're going to provide a safe, comfortable, calm place for someone, and they're really going to appreciate it, and it's going to be good for them. We have actually found that safe, calm, and comfortable for our 21-year-old is like the worst thing possible for her. She can handle it for a few days, and then she's got to bolt, and so she does. She runs and she disappears because she knows how to thrive in chaos. And she doesn't know how to thrive in calm. And so again, just really it's an ongoing struggle. It never really goes away, of having to completely abandon, in some ways, your expectations of how other people are going to think, because they're not going to think like you. And a lot of things aren't going to make sense. And that's going to lead you to a point where you begin to wonder sometimes, why do we keep doing this, right? It'd be a lot easier if we just quit. It'd be a lot easier if we didn't have to deal with this in our life. And that's another thing that I think it's important for all of us to be confronted with every once in a while. And I don't see those as moments of weakness per se, and we hit these points every once in a while. It'd be a whole lot easier if she wasn't in our life. We didn't have to deal with it, all the trauma and all the stuff that comes with it. But it's also important that we process through that every once in a while to really reaffirm why we're doing what we're doing and what our goal is, and that this isn't a short-term fix. This is a long-term, lifelong journey of healing. And so I guess, both of those examples of just ongoing effects of trauma and being a part of each other's lives for a long, long time, I guess kind of have a similar point to them, that this isn't a quick fix. This is going to be a lifelong journey of struggle and process and healing and pressing in. And when that gets hard, and when you question whether or not it's worth it, again, we press the gospel deeply into people so that in those moments when it's hard and they wonder if it's worth it, they have the gospel to fall back on and remind them of why they do what they do.
I love that.
So it's such good advice, and also so applicable wherever you're at, whether you're fostering or interacting with somebody at work, and just keeping that in mind. And that's a struggle that we've definitely shared with just having to remind ourselves constantly that, hey, these kiddos have come from a very different place and very different perspectives, and things that we think would be logical are not logical.
But I mean, also, I would say even like in marriage or just any relationships that you have, I think it's easy for you, in your mind, you say A plus B equals C, but you don't know what that person's A is or B. And you're like, why did you get Q? But they're like, no, that's C, and it doesn't all match, but it doesn't make it wrong either. And I think something that is beautiful about the fact that you've had your daughter for 4 years and she's had these children, and you're like, that's so interesting. I don't feel like we've taught you that, but okay. But like, you're still in her life in a chapter, her story isn't finished yet. And I think so often we, in society, we want these quick fixes. I mean, Amazon delivers things same day.
Yeah.
And we're like, why aren't these results happening same day
Mhm.
or same year or same, you know, chapter of this book? But something that I like, we love reading memoirs and biographies. I love reading through chapters of, you know, hardship and
Mhm.
pain and work and suffering and all this stuff. And then to see people where they're at now, like, oh man, if we had stopped the book at this chapter,
Yeah.
we would have just thought you're a lost cause.
Mhm.
Like nothing's ever going to come of your story.
Mhm.
But to see, man, like God is at work
Mhm.
in every chapter and every person that you encounter, that you can just make an impact on those pages of their life. Like, I think we have to believe, you know, God did that for a reason, and that their story still has so much room to grow, you know.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
I know you have to go soon.
Yep.
So do you have a good word for us that you'd like to share specifically?
You know, whenever I'm asked that, you know, do you have a closing word of encouragement or anything? My mind immediately goes to, I think we've included something on this in the book, maybe not, I don't remember. The chapter of Hebrews 11 that outlines a series of people who saw what we would deem to be great victories through their faith, and then in the end describes a group of people who experienced what we would call great tragedy through their faith. And so it starts out talking about how some by faith saw the Red Sea split, they saw the walls of Jericho fall, and on and on and on. And then it ends by talking about some by faith were stoned to death. They were sawed in half. They were left destitute, living in caves and holes in the ground. And so it kind of builds this construct of, by faith, some people experience these outcomes and other people experience these outcomes. And in our world, here's you know, going back to what we've just said, just our perspectives and the way that we think. I think one thing the gospel does is transform the way that we think. And I think Paul even alludes to that when he says that one of the greatest points of our sanctification is the renewal of our minds, so that we can prove and attest what the will of God is. In other words, our thinking is broken, and we need it to be redeemed so that we can really understand who God is and what God does. So an example of that would be, we see the walls of Jericho fall in someone's life and we go, ah, victory. We see that another person being stoned to death and we'd say, ah, tragedy, defeat, because we've been hardwired to think in those terms.
Yeah.
And then the gospel steps in and says, we need to transform the way that you think about that. The focus is not on the outcome, the walls of Jericho falling or being stoned to death. The focus is on the faith, which preceded both of those things.
Mhm.
And the end of Hebrews 11 says, all of them, all these people who experienced really hard things and who experienced really beautiful things, all of them were commended for their faith.
Mhm.
In other words, all of them were faithful. Despite experiencing very different outcomes. And so my words of encouragement to families often is be careful not to get caught up in the trap of measuring your success or failure on this journey only based on the outcomes that you're able to produce. Because there are going to be seasons and situations where you aren't able to produce the kinds of outcomes that you want to be able to produce. And you're going to want to begin to feel like, I'm failing at this foster care thing. You should take my license away. If there was a competition, I would come in dead last, world's worst foster parent, right? Because I'm not able to produce the outcomes. I'm not able to fix, heal, and get them, get this 21-year-old to stop making ridiculous decisions, and on and on and on and on. But I don't think that God is really so much concerned with our ability to produce outcomes as much as he is focused on our willingness to just be faithful. And sometimes on this journey, we're going to see breakthrough. It's going to feel like the walls of Jericho are falling and the Red Sea is splitting. And sometimes on this journey, we're going to experience heartache. It's going to feel like we're being stoned to death. But at all times on this journey, God says, don't worry about that. I'll take care of that. You just focus on being faithful. That our goal would be that he looks at us and says, well done, good and faithful servants. And so part of the renewal of our minds is changing the way that we define success and failure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Success is not rooted in our outcomes, and failure is not rooted in our outcomes. I like to say it this way: the opposite, in the kingdom of God, the opposite of failure is not success; it's faithfulness.
That's so
Um,
good.
That's awesome.
and so, God's expectation is that we just be faithful and trust that we are participating with Him in the renewal of all things. In order for things to be renewed, sometimes they first have to be destroyed.
Yes.
And we've renovated a couple houses, we've remodeled a couple houses, and it gets a lot. You think it's ugly at first, and you say, "Oh, we want to change everything." Well, it gets even uglier before it gets beautiful.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
everything. That's renewal. Is things can get hard, but we're participating with Him in the renewal of all things.
Yeah.
And we can trust that in the end, all things will be renewed. Maybe not on this side of eternity,
Right.
but at some point in eternity, God's going to renew all things. We get to be participators in that now. And His expectation on us is that we would just be faithful with that.
Beautiful.
Love it.
And on that note, the room you're in right now looks gorgeous. So
Thank you.
Well done.
It used to not. I promise.
What a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
All right, our last question for you is, what is a simple thing that is bringing you joy these days? We had an episode where we talked about simple joys, and something that brings us joy is our water picks. We just got those water flossers. Somehow, for no good reason, probably because we're in our 40s now.
Yeah.
We're like, this is incredible.
Yeah, for sure. What brings me joy now? So back on the house remodeling thing, we actually just moved about 6 months ago and have been remodeling, but we moved because our girls are getting older now, and we have 4 girls. They're all very active social lives, but all their friends kind of live in one particular area of our city. And so we moved into the middle of that 6 months ago.
Love that.
They can literally just walk out the front door and go.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time, there's been multiple times, even in the last 6 months, where we've looked around the house and it's empty. Like the girls are just gone in the neighborhood. And that it's been a good, even in the midst of the ridiculous year that we've all had, that's been kind of those affirming moments where you go, yeah, like this is why we did it. The process has been horrible. It's no fun moving.
Yes.
But this is why we did it. It's been totally worth it. So it's been fun to see that.
Oh man, so great. Jason, man, thank you for having a blog that is incredible. That's a great resource, but also having a contact page that works.
Yeah.
So that's how we got in touch with you.
Yes.
So we're not just personal friends with Jason Johnson, although now we can say we are.
We are now.
We've been friends for an hour.
Yeah.
But man, thank you for just saying yes to being on our podcast. Like, it's such a gift to us and to our listeners. We will share all of the resources we talked about, your book, all the YouTube book club stuff that you did. We'll link to that, and then also to your friend and to the great work that he's doing in Houston. And man, I just hope that we can get more stuff started in other cities where we can look at the micro problems and think about the gifts God has given us, and how can we share that with society at large.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, guys. It's been fun hanging out.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again, and we wish you the best. And if there's anything that we can do in the future to support you and the work that you guys are doing, please let us know. We would be happy to jump on.
Yeah, for sure. Let me know when this goes up and I'll help share it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
very
much, Jason.
Thanks.
Have a good
Bye-bye.